The wealth you already have. The wealth you already have. Seek first his kingdom and righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. Most books about money open with a spreadsheet. This one opens with a confession. In 1998, sitting at a cubicle at my first corporate job, I pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote down what I wanted most. 5 houses, a net worth of $5 million, passive income that made work optional. Goals that were, on their face, entirely reasonable. Goals that were also, I suddenly felt, entirely wrong. Something stopped me. Not a voice exactly, and more like a conviction. I flipped the paper over and started again. This time I wrote, daily Bible reading, regular prayer, faithful ministry, discipling others. I pursued those goals first. And then, over the years that followed, something unexpected happened. The goals on the other side of the paper came too. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. I share this not as a formula. The universe does not dispense real estate portfolios in exchange for quiet times, but as context. Because everything in this chapter, and everything that follows, rests on a premise. Money is a tool, not a treasure. The moment it becomes your treasure, it begins to destroy you. The moment you treat it as a tool, wield it in service of something larger, it becomes one of the most powerful forces for good you can deploy. Before we talk about what to do with your money, we need to talk about how to think about it. Gratitude, the starting point for every dollar. The Bible is unusually blunt about the origin of wealth. It doesn't say wealth comes from hard work, though it commends hard work. It doesn't say wealth comes from intelligence, though wisdom is praised throughout Proverbs. It says wealth comes from God. King David, at the coronation of his son Solomon, prayed, "Both riches and honor come from you." 1 Chronicles 29:12. Moses, preparing the Israelites to enter a land of abundance, warned them against the most natural of human delusions, the belief that they had earned what they were about to receive. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth. Deuteronomy 8:18. And the Apostle Paul, never one to leave a boast unchallenged, asked the Corinthians, "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not?" 1 Corinthians 4:7. The point isn't that effort is irrelevant. Paul himself described working harder than anyone around him. The point is that the capacity for effort, the circumstances that reward it, the mind that directs it, and the opportunity that catches it are all given, not manufactured. Gratitude isn't just a religious nicety here. It's an accurate accounting of the facts. Why does this matter practically? Because gratitude and greed cannot occupy the same heart simultaneously. Gratitude says, "This is enough, and more than I deserve." Greed says, "This is not enough, and I need more." Every financial decision you make flows downstream from one of those two orientations. This is where the journey begins. The idolatry trap. When money becomes your god. Solomon, who had more money than almost anyone in recorded history, was also one of its sharpest critics. He watched what wealth did to people, including himself, and wrote with the weary authority of experience. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This, too, is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 5:10. The word he used, meaningless or vanity, is the same word he uses throughout Ecclesiastes for things that seem substantial but turn out to be empty. Money pursued as an end produces exactly the result of any addiction. Temporary relief followed by a larger craving. The tolerance grows. The satisfaction shrinks, the hole gets deeper. Solomon identified 3 specific ways that greed betrays the people who give themselves to it. First, it never satisfies. The hunger is structural, not incidental, and no amount of accumulation fixes it. Second, it tends to be counterproductive. The sleep of a laborer is sweet, but as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. Ecclesiastes 5:12. Greater wealth often brings greater complexity, greater exposure, and greater anxiety. Third, wealth held too tightly is fragile. Wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners, or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there is nothing left for them to inherit. Ecclesiastes 5:13-14. The man who makes his barns bigger ends up with nothing. Jesus captured all of this in a single parable. A prosperous farmer kept expanding his storage facilities until he had accumulated enough to retire in comfort. The night he decided to stop building, God told him his life was over. The commentary is brief and devastating. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God. Luke 12:21. When money becomes your goal, money becomes your God. The New Testament uses unusually strong language here. Paul writes that greed is idolatry, Colossians 3:5. Not like idolatry, not a form of idolatry, idolatry. The worship of money is functionally identical to the worship of a false god. It captures your affection, shapes your decisions, demands your time, and promises things it cannot deliver. The corrective isn't poverty or indifference to financial well-being, it's right order. Jesus didn't say money was evil. He said you couldn't serve two masters simultaneously, Matthew 6:24. The question is always which one is actually running the show. Contentment, the most misunderstood financial virtue. There is a pervasive and damaging misreading of the biblical concept of contentment. People hear, "be content with what you have," and translate it as, "accept your lot, stop striving, don't want more." This reading turns contentment into a kind of holy passivity, spiritualized resignation. That is not what the Bible teaches. Paul, who wrote the definitive passage on contentment, was anything but passive. He described himself as working harder than all of them. 1 Corinthians 15:10. He planted churches, trained leaders, crossed continents, argued theology, and wrote a substantial portion of the New Testament, all while making and selling tents to finance his ministry and that of his companions. His contentment wasn't a lack of ambition. It was a settled orientation toward God that remained stable across radically different circumstances. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances, Philippians 4:11. He could be brought low and he could abound. He could face need and he could face plenty. Neither destination destabilized him because his security wasn't located in either. This is not the same as accepting poverty when you can change it. As I said to my class, accepting poverty, suffering, or abuse when you can change things isn't contentment, it's stupidity. True contentment is emotional stability rooted in something that circumstances cannot touch. It doesn't prevent you from working to improve your situation. It prevents that situation from defining your worth or ruling your peace. In practical terms, contentment is the antidote to two of the most destructive financial behaviors: compulsive spending, the attempt to fill an internal emptiness with external purchases, and compulsive hoarding, the attempt to secure an internal peace through external accumulation. Both fail. Both have been failing since Solomon documented them 3,000 years ago. Contentment, by contrast, produces the mental clarity to make deliberate decisions, the emotional stability to stay the course, and the gratitude that keeps money in its proper place. For the Christian, contentment is rooted in a personal and saving relationship with Jesus Christ. Knowing that one with all authority in heaven and on earth loves you, has paid the price for your sins, and guarantees your eternal home in heaven, you can find joy, peace, and strength to face anything life can throw at you. Paul wrote, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me," Philippians 4:13. The Bible's surprisingly practical money advice. Here is something that will surprise many Christians. The Bible has more to say about money than about heaven and hell. There are approximately 2,350 verses that reference money or possessions, compared to roughly 700 to 800 combined references to heaven and hell. 11 of Jesus' 39 parables deal directly with money or possessions. Yet most of what gets preached and published in Christian circles on the topic of money covers two topics: tithing, and the dangers of greed. Both are real and important, but they leave an enormous amount of practical wisdom on the table. Wisdom that has direct application to how you earn, save, invest, and spend. Consider just a sampling of what you can learn from Scripture. Save consistently and patiently. Whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Proverbs 13:11. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. Proverbs 21:20. Solomon's advice to study the ant, which stores in summer what it will need in winter without a supervisor or external mandate, is the oldest articulation of automated, disciplined saving in any text I know of. Proverbs 6:6-8. The underlying principle is consistent. Gradual accumulation over time, applied with patience and without drama, produces results that spectacular short-term bets almost never do. This is not a peripheral point in the Bible's financial teaching. It is the central one. Don't be hasty for riches. The trustworthy person will get a rich reward, but a person who wants quick riches will get into trouble. Proverbs 28:20. I learned this lesson twice, each time at a cost of $100,000. The first time was in 1998. Reading articles about the Chinese stock market, I persuaded my father to invest $100,000 in a penny stock that every source I consulted said was sure to surge. It doubled in a single day. I was elated but too busy at work to sell. By the next morning, it had fallen 50%. By the end of the week, it had taken nearly everything with it. My father's response when I called to confess what I had done with his money was a single question. Did you learn something? He didn't rage. He didn't demand repayment. He let the lesson cost what it cost. 20 years later, I made the same mistake again, this time with my own money. The dollar amount was the same, $100,000. The experience was essentially identical. The lesson, apparently, takes more than one application. What I learned finally and permanently was this. The stock market is not a lottery, and trying to time it is not investing. It is speculation. The two activities look similar from the outside and produce radically different outcomes over time. The investor who puts money into a low-cost index fund and leaves it alone will, over decades, vastly outperform the speculator who chases the next big thing, and will do so with a fraction of the stress, the risk, and the lost sleep. Warren Buffett's wager. In 2007, Warren Buffett made a bold public wager. He bet $1 million that a simple, low-cost S&P 500 index fund would outperform any collection of hedge funds over the next decade. Only one person on all of Wall Street accepted, Ted Sades of Protégé Partners, who selected 5 hand-picked hedge funds managed by some of the brightest minds in finance. The results weren't even close. By the time Sades conceded early in 2017, before the bet's official end date, Buffett's boring index fund had gained $854,000 on the million invested. The hedge funds? Just $220,000. The index fund's total return over the decade was 125.8%, while the hedge funds managed between just 2.8% and 87.7%. Since that bet ended, the pattern has continued. Through 2025, more than 95% of actively managed funds continue to underperform their S&P 500 benchmark over any 15-year period, according to S&P Global's SPIVA scorecard. The boring approach keeps winning. The culprit wasn't incompetence, it was fees. Hedge funds typically charge 2% annually plus 20% of any profits. Those costs, compounded year after year, quietly devoured returns that even talented managers struggled to replace. Fees turned a difficult challenge, beating the market, into an almost impossible one. Buffett's lesson was simple. The investor who does nothing, who resists the urge to time the market, chase returns, or pay for expert guidance, will, more often than not, beat the one who does everything. Invest and diversify. Ship your grain across the sea. After many days you may receive a return. Ecclesiastes 11:1. Solomon's point is simple. Money sitting still loses value. Deployed wisely, it grows. His follow-up verse is equally practical. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come upon the land. Ecclesiastes 11:2. Don't concentrate your risk. Diversification isn't financial timidity. It's the recognition that the future is uncertain and that spreading exposure across multiple assets protects you when any one of them fails. A practical hierarchy of investing for most people looks something like this. First, establish a high-yield savings account for your emergency fund and short-term needs. Check bankrate.com for current rates on FDIC-insured online savings accounts, which consistently outpace traditional banks. Second, once you have at least $1,000 you can leave untouched for 3 to 5 years, consider a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, such as Vanguard's VOO or Fidelity's FXAIX, which gives you ownership of 500 of the largest and most established companies in America and has returned an average of roughly 10% annually over the past century of market history. Third, as your capital grows, explore real estate, a vehicle so powerful in its combination of income, appreciation, leverage, and tax advantages that it earns its own dedicated chapter later in this book. The compounding math on even modest investments is staggering. $3,000 in a typical index fund today, left alone, becomes $6,000 in 7 years, $12,000 in 14, $24,000 in 21. You added nothing. You did nothing. Time and compound interest did the work. How did the S&P 500 achieve such exponential growth over time? The answer is simple. It had far more winning years than losing years. Looking at the annual returns of the S&P 500 going back nearly a century, the pattern is striking. The vast majority of years, roughly 7 out of every 10, produced positive returns. Those are the blue bars. The red bars, the losing years, are far fewer, and they tend to be followed quickly by strong recoveries. Let's put some numbers to that picture. Since 1928, the S&P 500 has posted positive annual returns in approximately 73% of all years. Negative years, the crashes, the recessions, the panics, account for only about 27% of the time. And in the years that were positive, the gains were often large. In the years that were negative, the losses, while painful in the moment, were almost always temporary. Some of the biggest single-year gains include 1954, when the index returned over 52%. 1958 came in at nearly 44%. 1995 delivered over 37%. 2019 added more than 31%. Even after the dot-com crash, after the financial crisis, after the pandemic, the index recovered and went on to new highs. The losing years are worth naming too, because fear of them is what keeps many people out of the market entirely. 1931 was the worst on record, a loss of nearly 47% during the Great Depression. 2008 fell about 37% during the financial crisis. 2022 dropped roughly 18% as inflation surged. These were real, painful periods for anyone who needed their money immediately. But here is the critical point. An investor who stayed in the market through every one of those down years, who did nothing, who simply held on, came out the other side with an average annual return of approximately 10% over the full century. The losses were real. The recoveries were also real, and the recoveries compounded over time vastly outweighed the losses. This is why dollar-cost averaging, investing a fixed amount every month regardless of market conditions, is so powerful. When prices drop, your fixed contribution buys more shares. When prices rise, your existing shares are worth more. You automatically buy more of what is on sale. And you never have to predict which years will be blue and which will be red. The bar chart tells the story visually, but the lesson it teaches is this. Time in the market, not timing the market, is what builds wealth. The blue bars outnumber the red bars, and the blue bars are what compound into financial freedom. Don't overanalyze. Act. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap. Ecclesiastes 11:4. The farmer who waits for perfect conditions to plant will starve. The investor who waits for the ideal entry point will never invest. There is a counterintuitive relationship between risk aversion and actual risk. People who refuse to invest in order to avoid the possibility of losing money end up losing money, slowly, invisibly through inflation, with mathematical certainty. The person who never starts a business, never buys a rental property, never puts money in the market, has not avoided risk. They have chosen a different kind of risk, the guaranteed erosion of purchasing power over time. You don't need to understand everything before you act. You need to understand enough. Peter Lynch, whose Magellan Fund averaged roughly 29% annually over 13 years and consistently outperformed the market, built his philosophy around a deceptively simple idea. Invest in businesses you understand, use, and can evaluate from your own experience. Learn the fundamentals, apply them, and adjust as you learn more. Most millionaires, as Thomas Stanley documented in The Millionaire Next Door, are not financial geniuses. They are average people who understood a few principles well enough to act on them consistently over decades. Peter Lynch, One Up on Wall Street. Keep your eyes on the ball. Plant your seed in the morning and keep busy all afternoon. Ecclesiastes 11:6. Once you have built something worth having, stay attentive. Wealth that isn't maintained tends to drift. Donald Trump's first autobiography, The Art of the Deal, contains an instructive episode. At the height of his real estate success, Trump took his hands off the controls and began to simply enjoy his empire. He didn't notice the market deteriorating until it was too late. At one point, he owed billions of dollars to dozens of banks. He recovered through a combination of negotiation, sheer tenacity, and favorable timing, but the lesson was expensive. The goal of this book is to show you systems that largely run themselves so that financial freedom doesn't require your constant attention. Index funds, automated contributions, rental properties with good management, these reduce the supervision required, but they don't eliminate it. Keep your eyes on the ball. The spiritual priorities that make the financial path make sense. Before we move to the mechanics, I want to pause on something personal. I've been in corporate environments where my faith was a problem. I've had a boss demand I come in while I was in my morning devotions. I've had a supervisor forbid me from sending an email to my team that acknowledged God's provision in growing our company. I've had someone forge my signature on a document I refused to sign because it was a lie. A moment that made clear just how much leverage an employer holds over a person who depends on their next paycheck. Each time I prayed for the same thing, the freedom to do what I believed God was calling me to do, without my livelihood being used as a lever against my conscience. Financial freedom for me was never really about the numbers. It was about that freedom. The freedom to spend time with God without occupational constraint, to teach and counsel without charging for it, to give generously without calculating what I could afford, to say no to things that conflict with my values without wondering how I'll pay the mortgage. Your reasons will be your own, but I'd encourage you to name them before you begin. Not, I want to be rich. That's not a purpose, it's a direction. Something more specific. What will you do with financial freedom that you can't do now? Who will you help? What will you build? What will you say yes to that you currently have to refuse? The prophet Agur prayed for neither poverty nor riches, just enough to best honor God, Proverbs 37:9. That prayer sounds simple until you realize how much wisdom it contains. He understood that too little breeds desperation, the kind that can quietly compromise a person's integrity, one small concession at a time. And too much breeds a different danger, the slow drift toward self-sufficiency, where God becomes optional and gratitude becomes nostalgia. The goal is not maximum money. The goal is enough freedom to do what you are actually called and gifted to do. Let that be your North Star as we proceed. Part 2. Clearing the Ground. Chapter 3.